sunshine, the storm, and rain. In the midst of it all, though we stumble and fall, we shall rise again. Sometimes I feel despair. Just know that God is still standing there. So we shall overcome someday.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Operation Push Saturday Morning Forum. Everybody put your hands together. Here at Dr. King's workshop, the headquarters of the International Coalition, the Rainbow Push Coalition. We want to invite you to our international conference, June 28th through July 2nd. Call us at 773-256-2775 right now. We want you to get registered. And throughout the week, 773-FREEDOM. We want to dedicate our show today, our special broadcast, to a brother beloved, one of the top executives at Exelon, an elder in the church at Salem, head of our Rainbow Push Trade Bureau. Many of us have been following him as he has been fighting the battle for his health on Facebook. Emmett Vaughn made his transition, but we are rejoicing because that is what Emmett would want us to do. He is safe in the arms of Jesus. Give Emmett and his family a round of applause, everybody. We are coming to you live on the Impact Television Network. What is Impact? It is the largest African-American owned church network in the country, and we are so glad to be with you on Impact today. But we're also on Facebook Live, on the Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. page, on the Rainbow Push page, tomorrow morning on Keep Hope Alive with Reverend Jesse Jackson, his nationally syndicated radio show. We're going to be talking about Alabama and reproductive voting rights. You don't want to miss that conversation. Go to get your iHeart app at Patriot AM 1150. That's where you can catch us from 8 to 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, or Real Talk 910. You know, we got the conservatives and the progressives working for us on the Keep Hope Alive with Reverend Jesse Jackson radio show. But we want to hear from you. We want to know what you think about this repeal of women's voting rights. As we are looking at Brown versus Board of Education today, we've got a lot. Put your hands together. Aren't you going to hear a lot here? All right. And of course, on Monday, I will be at Pearls at 39th and Michigan. Want to see you starting at 6 o'clock, 6:45. Hot conversation, because we would have just left the inauguration of Lori Lightfoot here in Chicago, making history. Going to be talking about that and so much. And of course, I'll be covering that on WCPT here in Chicago. But you know what we try to do, and it's something we've gotten a lot of wonderful feedback from you about, our news of the week. We have to thank our staffer, Deshaun Simpson, and of course the curator, Alana Ford, for pulling together the great stories that many people are missing. Put your hands together, everybody. That's right. So keep your eyes locked right here for our news of the week.
Thank you for joining us. Here is the SMF Weekly Update.
Higher learning. Congratulations are in order. Reverend Jackson received his honorary degree from the University of the District of Columbia. Rainbow Push Coalition Vice President Reverend Dr. Todd Yeary received his JD. Push Excel National Executive Director Reverend Dr. Jeanette C. Wilson, Esquire, received the Distinguished Alumni Award from John Marshall Law School. And 7 incarcerated Illinois men received bachelor's degrees from Northeastern Illinois University Without Walls and Prison and Neighborhood Arts and Education Project in a graduation at Statesville Correctional Center, where the commencement speaker was activist and scholar Angela Davis. Against the backdrop of
give us the ballot, and we will quietly and nonviolently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17, 1954.
This week marked the 65th anniversary of the Supreme Court landmark decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, but the schools are more segregated today than they were in the 1960s.
We do believe that this decision in itself will encourage the people.
In the same district where Ruby Bridges became the first African-American child to attend an all-white elementary school in the South, the Senate confirmed Wendy Vitter to a lifetime federal judge appointment. This is the same Wendy Vitter who declined to say Brown versus the Board of Education was correctly decided upon, and who also supports the following controversial issue.
A divided U.S. Supreme Court on Thursday blocked a Louisiana abortion law a day before it was supposed to go into effect. However, that action is only temporary.
And Trump's Pell Grant is a disgraceful attack on education.
We grew weary of that arrangement of race segregation. Today it's evolved to resource segregation. That disparity between resource and race is even wider than it was 65 years ago. Go to the city Harper High School in Chicago or the Marshall High, and then go to the Naquan Valley, you see a story of two schools. The worst part is that they take the same exam.
Yet, we continue to right the wrongs as National Push Excel Executive Director, Reverend Dr. Jeanette C. Wilson, Esquire, along with Judge Greg Mathis, Dr. Julianne Malveaux, and Dr. Sonia Whitaker, convened a group of scholars, educators, business leaders, stakeholders, and students for the Push Excel Education Summit at Roosevelt University to address the crisis in education in America, featuring award-winning journalist and keynote speaker Nicole Hannah-Jones.
I think the most painful thing is that the kids understand that they are being set up to fail. They understand that they're being warehoused. They understand that they're being deprived. And they look at us every day and they're waiting for us to save them. That's our job. So when are we going to do it?
Whenever the playing field is even and the rules are public and the goals are clear and the referees are fair, we win. In Chicago, Reverend Jackson and staff attended the NBA Draft Lottery in Chicago at the Chicago Hilton and Towers Hotel, where he was lauded during an event hosted by Isaiah Thomas and rubbed shoulders with the best, brightest, legends, and executives of the league and of the sport. Who will they pick? Stay tuned. Who are you going to call? Reverend Jackson took bags of food to peace activists locked in and occupying the Venezuelan embassy, emphasizing we must discourage an invasion and occupation of Venezuela.
War is expensive and war is futile. You cannot starve Venezuela to submission. You must use aggressive diplomacy, bring both sides to the table, and with the help of the United Nations, figure out a conflict resolution short of violence. Right now, we're on a dangerous course in our own hemisphere. War drums are beating, babies and borders on the U.S. side in Mexico and Texas, Yemen, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan. We must go another of our foreign policies, foreign values. It does not make rational sense.
Keep Hope Alive executive producer, writer, co-host, journalist, and song stylist Santita Jackson stirred the crowd with an introductory song before Reverend Jackson received the President's Economic Impact Award from the annual National Minority Supplier Development Council in New York City. And the women hosted the annual meet and greet to invite everyone to the International Women's Luncheon during the Rainbow Push Convention.
I thank you for choosing us.
Loving you, thinking of you. Don't forget to pray. Mrs. Jacqueline Jackson will participate in the Global Conversations speaker series on Monday, May 20th, 2019 in Detroit at 11 a.m. at Wayne County Community College District in Detroit, moderated by Mildred Gaddis, news talk show host on WDMK KISS 105.9 FM. Tune in to In Depth with Graham Bensinger, who presents an exclusive interview with Reverend Jackson on Fox WFLD this Saturday at 5:30 p.m. Please read and share widely Reverend Jackson's Chicago Sun-Times article, 65 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, we risk going backward.
Join the movement. Join Rainbow Push.
Amen, amen. Put your hands together, everybody. It's better than that. That's right. They were just asking if you can be a good American, a good civic citizen on C-SPAN this morning, if you follow the news. Many people have tuned out. They've just said, I don't want to look at the news. Well, you should. But we want to pull together pieces for you to pay particular attention to throughout the week. We don't want you to miss a thing, right? We want you to know that Reverend Jackson was pulling for the Venezuelans this week, right? We want you to know what's going on. All right, all right, all right. I'm bringing to you a gentleman who is a scholar. He is a pastor of the Douglas Memorial Community Church. He's our vice president here at Rainbow Push, and he is also now a newly minted graduate of law school. Put your hands together for everybody, for Reverend Dr. Todd Yeary. You can do better. Come on.
Good morning, Push family. It is good to be here, and I am certainly excited about the work that we continue to do together under the leadership of our fearless, stalwart champion for justice and social change, the Reverend Jesse L. Jackson Sr. We certainly continue to be amazed at his energy and his tenacity, his resilience, and his persistence as he finds his way across the globe, doing more with folks who are half his age and twice his strength. To be able to make a difference in the lives of so many people. As we continue this conversation this morning, let me just ask that you would keep members of our family in your prayers. Our own Frank Watkins at the passing of his mother, Ruby, of St. Louis at 106 years old. We are grateful for long life, longevity, and we now thank God for a blessed memory. We certainly, at the beginning of the show, lifted up our beloved friend and brother, Emmett Vaughn, and his transition to Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Exelon Corporation. Unita Blackwell, the first black woman elected as mayor in the state of Mississippi, and a long-time civil rights and social justice heroine. Dr. Anderson Thompson of Northeastern University, Chuck Barksdale of the Dells made his transition, and actress Peggy Lipton. We also keep former President Jimmy Carter in our prayers as he recovered from a fall and hip surgery, and I understand he's going to be teaching Sunday school in the morning. And so we thank God for commitment and passion. And also let me thank our Executive Director of Push Excel for her facilitation of an important policy discussion around education in our Education Summit. That's one of the things that we need to talk about, because if you have not yet done it, I need you to mark your calendar for June 28th to July 2nd. June 28th to July 2nd. You need to be in Chicago as we will convene the Rainbow Push International Convention. This year's theme, that's right, it's good to come together. Good to come together. 400 years later, Reverend wants to focus on repairing the damage done. It's not just talking about history, it's talking about the effect. And there are many effects that we still must address in the United States of 2019. Many of us are moving ahead to 2020 as if the election is going to cure all of our issues. But we've got to fight between now and next November. And if we don't raise the agenda now, 2020 will be an absolute exercise in futility. And so I need you to go to rainbowpush.org or dial 773-FREEDOM. Go ahead and make your plans to be here for June 28th to July 2nd. Many of the top presidential candidates have been invited. Some of them have actually already confirmed. Mayor Pete Buttigieg, Beto O'Rourke, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Joe Biden, Amy Klobuchar, and the list goes on and on. We need to be here to hear what is on the agenda. All too often, Reverend tells us that we do not get what we deserve, we get what we negotiate. And we need to have a transactional negotiation conversation with those who want to ascend to the highest office of the land. And we need to make sure our issues are on their agenda. So June 28th to July 2nd, business, labor, sports, voting rights, the 2020 election. We need to talk about all of that. And also stay tuned to Keep Hope Alive Radio as we will talk about the decision to curtail the choices of women in Alabama. Now, the last thing with the few seconds that I've got left, on yesterday, I celebrated the receiving of my Juris Doctor degree from the University of Maryland Law School. Let me tell you how it happened. It was actually at 16 years old as a senior at Durham High School. One Reverend Jesse Jackson came through Durham before he made the announcement that he was running for president in 1984. He talked to a group of high school students from Durham High and Hillside in a joint assembly, and I happened to be the one to introduce him that day. After I introduced him, as he stepped to the podium, he asked me in my ear, as he often does, "What will you be, a preacher or a lawyer?" And I remember what I said to him. I said, "You never know, maybe both." I never knew that it would come to pass just the way he asked it, but that's how Reverend has operated in so many of our lives. He's asked us questions to change how we see the world and think about our possibilities. And so I wanted to say thank you to Reverend today. That's really why I'm here. On yesterday, as I walked across that stage, one of the things that denotes the recipient of a doctoral degree is often the headwear. I don't have much to give him, but Reverend, I know you have a wall of hats in your office, and I want you to have my doctoral tam that I wore in graduation. Thank you, my friend, for being a good mentor and leader. Thank you for getting me in a whole lot of trouble, and I hope one day to make you proud. We continue on. Thank you. Come on, let's get ready. Convention's coming. Put your hands together. And let's be inspired now by our oratorical presentation. Morris McKay is here from Wiley College. Put your hands together and let's hear from him as he comes.
At the entrance of a West Philadelphia high school, there was an officer. He asked me if I had any weapons on me. I hold up my book, and I guess he doesn't find that funny. We know change. Hell, we grown used to change. Like the corner deli changed to the corner store, then to the corner Western Union, then to the corner vacant buildings, crackheads built in. We seen change, like the neighborhood kids splashing water from the fire hydrant, from hydration from the heat, to hook to the fire hose to put out the hellish flames that swallowed our neighborhood whole. I'm building me a home. You see, this earthly house is going to soon decay, and my soul, you know, it got to have somewhere to live, somewhere to stay. They moved me in, stigmatized me, and kicked me out, and whitewash my home. Either way, I might die on this sacred ground. You see, I'm the ghost of the playground, and you look alive. You see, these grounds belong to my ancestors, and you took that away from me. It was a school here where teachers could come, where students could come, and now it's nothing. And that's why we could smell change. You know, the smell of the neighborhood bodega melted and morphed into the smell of drill hammers and cement. The smell of roses into the smell of dust. As we walked into the steps of our school, we stood shocked to see our school spilling like a crash, crushed into clutter. In 2018, Chris Kennedy, a Democratic candidate for Illinois' governor, accused Mayor Rahm Emanuel for waging a strategic gentrification plan in Chicago. He said that the mayor permits a selective containment of the violence that negatively impacts students, prompting them to leave the city. Instead of using resources to revitalize the city, they're shutting down the resources, including the closing of 18 public schools in the Inglewood and Bronzeville area, just to push people of color out. So through the poetry, We Know Change by D. Nelson, I Hate Packing by Mike Moore, Ghost on the Playground by Morris McKay, and Gentrification by Maya Marsh. Not a program, but a lesson. Because my school was one of the schools shut down my senior year, and I'm worried my home will be next. Good morning. I'm Morris McKay from Wiley College, and I was selected for the great benefit of introducing the great Reverend Jesse L. Lewis Jackson.
Oh, somebody, I may be down but not destroyed, empty but not void, 'cause I am somebody. Oh, I am somebody. Oh, I am somebody. Yeah, you can turn. At the end of this day, sing, I am somebody. Let your neighbor know that you are somebody. Oh, I am somebody. Yeah. At the end of this day, trying to walk away, sing, I am somebody. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor,
somebody. I am somebody. I am somebody. Respect me, protect me, never neglect me. Red and yellow, brown, black, and white. We're all precious in God's sight. Everybody is somebody. Stop the violence, save the children. Stop the violence, save the children. If my mind can conceive it and my heart can believe it, I know I can achieve it. I am God's child. I will never surrender. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive.
Oh, at the end of this day, you can turn and walk away, say, I am somebody. Oh, I am somebody. Oh, I am somebody. Hey, they can turn and walk away, but at the end of this day, sing, I am somebody.
Let me express my thanks and delight to be with you again today. Last week, Reverend Sister Maxine Watts and I were together. UGC in Washington, D.C. Tomorrow we'll be in Washington, D.C. 2 to 3 o'clock tomorrow on a peace vigil. The war is breaking out in Yemen, with subsidizing the Saudis killing the Yemenite people, and the tension with North Korea and warships moving toward Iran and Mexico. Too much war, too much war. We demand peace and justice. And how are you going to pay for the war? Well, one way you're going to pay for them is that $1.9 billion for Pell Grants, small colleges, black colleges, 1.9 is now being used for the military. So 1.9 billion should be used for black colleges and pushed as going to the military. Part of our fight. Third piece is that don't forget this, my friends, is that we're in the fight of our lives. Every Saturday now we're going to have our young people. We met with the superintendent of schools in Chicago this week. 20,000 high school seniors, 20,000 high school seniors. We march across the stage, diploma in one hand, bullet card in the other. We're going to register 20,000 hospices. It's a Rainbow Youth Voter Crusade. Youth Empowerment and Voter Crusade. Let me express my thanks lastly to my daughter Santita, who is the PR woman. Sister Jeanette, where's Jeanette? Give Jeanette a big hand. Dr. Whitaker, thank you very much. My friend and brother beloved for all of my political life, Congressman Bobby Rush. Bobby Rush, please stand. Attorney Bob Pierre, Bob Pierre. On now to get ready to bring on in a few moments. This is the week 65 years ago, America, midways before and after Brown v. Board of Education. It's not just a matter of education. Brown made apartheid illegal in this country. We made a move to end separate, unequal as a matter of law, not of culture, not of habit. Put your hands together. We're going to fight back. I want Nicole Hannah Jones, who's an outstanding writing with the New York Magazine, a great writer. Here's here for Nicole Hannah Jones, New York Times Magazine. Give her a hand. Give her a big hand. Nicole, I want to ask you a kind of basic question. Explain what was Brown v. Board of Education? What was the intent and what did it do?
It's on. Hello, everyone. So Brown v. Board of Education, of course, is the landmark Supreme Court ruling in 1954. I'm not sure what you want me to do with this mic. You want me to hold two mics?
Thank you, Nicole.
No problem.
You put your hands together for our New York Times investigative reporter. Reverend Jackson, please come back. What we're going to do is moderate a conversation so that we can understand the implications of Brown v. Board of Education. No one has fought harder in this and for a greater period of time than Reverend Jesse Jackson, right? So we'd like to ask questions of Reverend Jackson as well. And we're going to bring on Reverend Dr. Todd Yeary, because we need to have all of these perspectives as we find out about Brown versus Board of Education and how it's impacted us. Reverend Jackson, could you go to the... Okay, well, there we go. How about that? First of all, could you first explain what is the Brown v. Board of Education? Many people feel that it's an economic decision. Some people have we've looked at it through a racial lens. What is it?
Right, so Brown v. Board of Education is the Supreme Court ruling that outlaws school segregation. It rules that prior to that, the Supreme Court said that segregation was okay as long as separate schools for black children were made equal. But of course, I don't have to tell anyone in this room that that was never the case, that segregated schools for black children were never equal. And the NAACP challenged segregation before the Supreme Court, and a unanimous ruling of 9 judges said that segregation could no longer be the law of the land. Many people think that Brown v. Board of Education was about resources, but Brown v. Board of Education was really about racial caste. It was arguing that if you separate black children, you are stigmatizing black children, you are demeaning black children, you're denying them full access to their citizenship. So when we think about the Supreme Court ruling in Brown, that then lays the foundation for black people to challenge segregation in every other aspect of life. So without Brown, you wouldn't have had the 64 Civil Rights Act, you wouldn't have had the 68 Civil Rights Act, you wouldn't have had the challenges in the Montgomery bus boycott that overturned segregated seating on buses. And so Brown really sets that stage for the end of legal apartheid across all of American life.
When we look at Brown today, Okay, that was 6.5 decades ago. Where are we today as they're talking about the resegregation of schools? Is that happening? Is Brown null and void? Talk to us.
So I would clearly not argue that Brown is null and void, but Brown has never really been enforced outside of the South. So one could look in any school in Chicago and see that black children and Latino children are still extremely segregated in northern cities all across the country. We never had much political will to enforce Brown v. Board outside of the South. And we've actually seen schools that were desegregated starting to resegregate. So when you look at the data now, black children are about as segregated as they were in the 1970s. So we've gone back in time.
You continue to talk about outside of the South. I've heard you say that a couple of times. What do you mean? Was school segregation a problem in the North or not? Because many people in the North feel that they're so enlightened, it didn't happen here.
Yeah, I mean, anybody in this room who migrated from the South to the North knows that the North was not a promised land for black people. And there was a great deal of segregation. And in fact, the city of Chicago schools were placed under a desegregation order as well, as were schools in New York, as were schools in Detroit, as were schools in Philadelphia. So segregation in the North was not by law, but it was still being implemented by official policy. So school board members were assigning black children to black schools, white children to white schools, allowing white children to flee schools that were designated as black. And again, one can look across the city today and see that the white children who remain in Chicago public schools are concentrated in a very small number of high-performing schools, and black and brown children are concentrated in a large number of low-performing schools.
So do you think that the distinction, or should I say the line between the highly selective public schools and the neighborhood schools, how does that impact Brown, or how did Brown impact it?
I mean, Brown did not have a great deal of impact in Chicago, because what happened was when places like Chicago were placed under court order, white people simply fled the public schools. And in the North, as you know, you can just move a couple miles across an invisible municipal barrier line to a white suburb with white schools, and you didn't have to worry about desegregation. So while Brown outlawed legal segregation, you had to actually force integration to undo that segregation, and that's just never happened up here. Name your Democratic white mayor of Chicago, and none of them were advocates for school integration, and most of them were not advocates for housing integration.
Well, let's look at what happened on the federal level, because of course we saw the fight shift to the U.S. House of Representatives, and most particularly the U.S. Senate in the mid-'70s, and we saw a showdown. In fact, many would argue that the first black senator elected from the state of Massachusetts, Edward Brooke, lost his seat because of his stance on pushing for busing.
Absolutely.
Which is, he said, this is at the heart of Brown v. Board of Education. And interestingly enough, one of our presidential candidates who ran, Joe Biden, ran on busing. He said, look, we need to desegregate the schools, but he got to the Senate and turned away because of his neighborhood. Talk to us.
Right, so there was a tremendous amount of white backlash to Brown v. Board. Initially, that backlash was in the South because white Northerners thought that Brown only applied to the South. They didn't think that they were segregating children up here. And once Brown came to the North, the way that they had to integrate schools in the North, because housing segregation was so bad, was by busing kids out of their neighborhoods, because neighborhood schools reflected the racial segregation of the neighborhoods. That's when you saw white Northern support for school desegregation really disappear. And they used busing really as the red herring. It wasn't really about busing, as they used to say in the 70s, it ain't the bus, it's us. So it wasn't about that busing was a problem, it was about who was being bused into white schools. So Joe Biden, who's the presidential candidate that you were speaking about, actually just recently came out that behind the scenes he was working with white segregationists. He was working with Senator Eastland, who was one of the most openly racist members of the Senate at that time, behind the scenes to stop busing, which really meant that he was working to end efforts to desegregate schools.
How should we interpret that? That was 40 years ago. What about in the lens, through the 2019 lens?
Well, he has not disavowed his opposition to busing for desegregation. And in fact, when he's been asked about it recently, he still says that he believes that was the right thing to do. And one can look at the Obama administration policies around education and see that they were not doing any efforts really to help integrate schools under Obama, and instead really led to a larger privatization of public schools, which we've also seen happen in Chicago with the proliferation of charter schools.
In fact, that really kicked off here in Chicago. Let me bring in Reverend Dr. Todd Yeary, because Nicole, he is from Baltimore, which has become notorious for segregated schools and for the schools, Congressman Bobby Rush, that have been undercapitalized, for want of another term. They have not gotten their resources. Reverend Dr. Yeary?
Well, I think it's important to put Brown in the historical context that takes us all the way back to the aftermath of the Civil War. When the 14th Amendment was ratified, it put two legal principles, and applied them to the states. One was due process, and the other was equal protection. Those two provisions then made states accountable for how they managed the inclusion of former slaves into the post-slavery economy. The immediate response was Southern states began to push back. We know that there are a number of cases post the end of the Civil War, and probably the most important Civil Rights Act in our history is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which said explicitly that whites and blacks were absolutely equal in all areas of life. It was unequivocal. What we then saw was a gradual erosion, an intentional pushback against the notion of white superiority, not just in the South, but in the nation. And so when Plessy v. Ferguson comes up, it actually institutionalizes what had been the erosion in the civil rights cases that came before the courts, that began to just chip away at the impact of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So when Separate but Equal comes along, based on the Plessy case, remember the Plessy case is in Louisiana on a train where Homer Plessy, a black guy who could pass, bought a first-class ticket, paid for his ticket, gave the conductor his ticket, and then disclosed, hey, oh, by the way, I'm black, at which point he was forced off of the train, even though he resisted, and then sued in court. That's when the court came up with this thing called separate but equal, right? That you could keep the races separate as long as the facilities were for the most part equal. And we know that separate and equal was a design, but it was not a practice. And so here's what we began to see. States actually had laws forbidding the educating of black students and white students together. It was state law. States had intentional practices that said you would not, there was no funding requirement in terms of equal dollars. And so when we get to Brown, there are a couple of issues. We had gone through the desegregation of higher education and graduate schools. University of Maryland, where I just graduated from on yesterday, had to be forced to allow black people to go to law school. We got to remember that. The University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill was forced to integrate in 1951 after McKissick v. Carmichael. And so we had a number of cases, test cases, that put Brown in position to then change the public schooling requirement across the country. And then what you end up with in Brown is a resistance to the 1954 decision that then leads to a second Brown decision the next year, where the Supreme Court then mandates that you must desegregate with all deliberate speed, because there was an intentional slowing down. We see it, right? They go slow. When they don't want to do it, they come up with all kinds of excuses about why they can't implement what the court has said. And now what we've seen with the change in the attitude around race in the country and the stacking of the courts is that really the impact of equal and public accommodations across the board, it wasn't just about schools, it was about everything that tied to our lives. We're now looking at the absolute assault on Brown v. Board, because that's been the pushback of this doctrine of white supremacy that they've tried to undo Brown since Brown was passed, the anniversary just having been marked yesterday.
Nicole, I mean, with your investigative work with the New York Times, is the Brown decision important today, particularly as we move into 2020? You know, whenever you do talk radio, which I do, whenever you do television, which I do, the thing that gets black people and people of color and poor people most animated, middle class people, the education of their children, right? Because education is the path upward for us. Should it, or is it an issue in 2020?
Yes, I think it is a foundational issue in 2020. You asked about Baltimore. Well, Baltimore, of course, is the birthplace of Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall sues the University of Maryland because the University of Maryland denied him admission, and he had to go to Howard and get his law degree, and then he was determined to dismantle apartheid in Maryland to get his vengeance, I guess you could say. But why does Brown matter? Because you look at Baltimore schools right now. Baltimore schools are extremely segregated. There's been a great deal of white flight. When white people leave a community, they also take their tax dollars with them. And so you have children today who are sitting in schools where if you read the conditions, it sounds like the conditions in the schools in 1953 when we were looking at black schools. Schools that don't have textbooks, schools that don't have heat, schools that don't have windows, schools that have rodents and pests. So I think there is no way we can deny that Brown still has relevance. And I think it's important to say Brown was never about saying that sitting a black child next to a white child made that black child smart. What Brown was saying was that in a country built on racial caste, you have to have white children and black children in the same building because we've never valued black children the same. And so if you want black children to get what we assure white children get, they have to be in the same spaces together. And when we separate the most marginalized of our kids, which are poor black children, we've never seen a community that has treated those children the same as white children. And so what we see is continually we are willing to sacrifice the education of black children. As you said, from the beginning, black children were intended to be educated. Black children in many state constitutions didn't provide for public education for black children at all, including Illinois. I think we sometimes forget Illinois was actually in many parts a de jure segregated state. In Illinois, in the southern part, didn't even desegregate until after Brown v. Board of Education.
Chicago, too.
Chicago as well. I mean, Chicago is definitely considered de jure segregated, and if you go back and look, Chicago schools right after the Civil War were integrated. And then as more black people started coming up from the South, white Chicagoans then started to demand segregation and actually passed by ballot measure to segregate schools. So this is the history and the legacy. And when you look at a place like Chicago now, when a school is targeted for integration, where they're trying to take a poor black school and merge attendance zones with a wealthier white school, white parents in Chicago fight against that integration just like they did 50 years ago. So what I think we need to remember about what the Supreme Court rules in Brown is that education is one of the most important foundations of government and also of citizenship. And as long as we are depriving black children of a quality education, we are depriving them actually of their full citizenship. And I think we see that every day, that our schools are operating as designed. Our schools are designed to create a laboring class, a class that will serve. And that's largely what our children are being educated to do, not to lead, but to serve.
Nicole Hatter-Jones of the New York Times, everybody. We're so excited to have her and Reverend Dr. Todd Geary with us today. Nicole, what would you, in the media, this is barely discussed, and it's barely written about. I think that's why it's of such tremendous import that the New York Times, America's newspaper of record, would invest in your investigation. What questions should we be asking in the mainstream media? I mean, because we have the power to write and to email. I mean, we have much more power. We can impact the general conversation far more than we know. But you, the viewer, the consumer of the media, because that's what you are, you have to get involved. What would you speak to them? Give us some media education here. What can we do to make Brown v. Board of Education and education for our children a top priority? The equal access to equal high-quality education, I have to borrow from Congressman Jesse Jackson, Jr.
I mean, the first questions that you should ask are about school funding. How much funding are high-poverty schools that serve a lot of black children receiving versus magnet schools, which serve a lot of white children? I always tell communities, request your school attendance zone maps. So school board members sit down, they draw maps, and they determine which kids will go to which schools. But they're actually as gerrymandered as electoral districts, and they're usually gerrymandered.
Say that one more time. Schools are what?
School attendance zones are as gerrymandered to produce certain results as congressional districts.
What do you mean produce certain results?
So you know that we draw congressional maps to make certain parts of a city or a state Democratic and certain parts of a city or state Republican. This is also done with school attendance zone maps, where they will draw around certain neighborhoods to ensure that certain schools serve white children and certain schools serve black children. And so when you look at the maps, they don't often make sense. They'll have little areas that aren't contiguous exactly. So in that same way, I always tell people in their communities, request these maps so that you can actually see how intentional the segregation is, but also you can challenge the maps. You can ask, why are these maps drawn to put white neighborhoods in certain schools and black neighborhoods in other schools? And the other big thing, of course, is the qualifications of the teaching staff that are often in black schools. They often have very high teacher turnover. They have teachers who are not certified to teach in the subjects that they're teaching our kids. And these are the way that you start to see these inequalities reproduced is long-term teacher vacancies. So the schools that I'm in, a lot of times, you can have a math class, you can have a science class where there's not a certified teacher for an entire year. How can our children compete when they don't have certified teachers in their classrooms? This does not happen in white schools. I don't know a wealthy white school that can go a year without a math teacher. But I know regularly poor black schools where there are no teachers even in the classrooms at all. There could be anyone in here could walk off the street and become a substitute teacher and sit and babysit kids. And the kids know that they're not learning. They know that they're not being taught. And I think those are the things that I empower community members to do, is we have to go into those schools and actually see what is happening behind the closed doors, because our children are seeing it. And then when they stop focusing so much on their education, we blame them. But why would I take my education seriously if adults don't take it seriously enough to give me a teacher in my classroom or a textbook to learn from?
Reverend Dr. Urie, we're not hearing that in 2020. That's not top of line.
Well, and it needs to be on the table, right? Because there's the de facto. What we're hearing is that's de facto segregation, right? It's within the rules of the policy making that produces an outcome that affirms certain interests. So white interests have a particular value to the exclusion of all others. We actually have the Stout case that's going through the courts right now, where you have the desire to remove from the county school district to set up their own school district that would be majority white, because it says that we have the right to decide how we're going to use public dollars to affirm certain interests. And if it's going to cause, the association with black folks, not just that you get to be more poor or somehow or other you get to be less than, right? There's some sort of accommodation that goes with it. We never affirm the normalcy of black genius and decide that we want to affirm it just that way. And so our challenge is in 2020 is we've got to put education and more importantly, the pushback against white supremacy that's been institutionalized by constitutional behavior. Baltimore was the home of redlining. It was the first city to pass a redlining law upon which other redlining statutes and ordinances were fashioned. Baltimore, white flight out of the heart of Baltimore City is what we now call the Jones Falls Expressway, I-83. It'll take you from the inner harbor to the outer country as quickly as you can get. And on both sides, there's disruption of what were otherwise contiguous, healthy neighborhoods. The notion of where are the jobs going. So here's what you're beginning to see is as these communities are shifting, and I'm glad you raised the point about construction of schools. Prior to the current construction plan of schools in Baltimore City, there had not been a new school built in Baltimore City in over 40 years before the legislation came out of the General Assembly a few years ago. And so we're beginning to see absolute denial. You're seeing kind of political indifference to be able to kind of push back. And so when we look at these things, we got to look at a number of these markers. What does it mean that you have now federal judges who are unqualified and don't even know history, much less the law, actually making the determinations and reshaping the constitutional obligations? We got to keep that on the table, and we've got to make it a high issue in 2020.
Absolutely, because the final minute belongs to you.
I would ask your viewers to think about how many of the presidential candidates are talking about education. What have you heard from them about this issue? Almost nothing. And that tells you our values. Jobs are important, but who works the jobs if our children aren't educated? So I think we need to spend a lot more time pressing our politicians and our candidates running for president. What do they plan to do around the unequal educational facilities and instruction and opportunities that our children have? Because we can't compete for jobs if we don't have an education to get those jobs.
You know, the story, the story of the verse, a lot of logically as I said, well, blacks don't have to sit beside whites to get an education. Negro brother has 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. You teach 5 languages. Children at Notre Dame come there in the summertime and compare it to our children. So it's not about sitting next to whites, it's sitting next to resources. Am I right about that?
The resource question is a big one, right? Because there's a certain value proposition. We assume that we can underfund schools of color and overfund white schools. So when we start looking at the resource question, remember one of the rules were you couldn't let white students and black students use the same textbooks, as if somehow the content would get contaminated if you transferred the information. And so we've got to go back and raise the moral issue. This is a moral issue in 2020, and we've got to make it a high priority.
It seems to me the critical that whole proposition is that we must revive our fierce turning to have one set of rules. We've one set of rules in football, basketball, baseball, not for education. So we must fight for one set of rules. We must learn to read, write, count, and compute. There's nothing we cannot do. We've never lost a battle that we fought, never won a battle unless we fought. It's fight back time for education. Fight back time. Put your hands together. Say, I am somebody. I am somebody. My mind is a pearl. I can learn anything in the world. My mind is a pearl. I can learn anything in the world. Stop the violence. Say, give a big hand for Dr. Nicole Hannah-Jones. From Dr. Todd Yeary, give him a big hand. Behan.
I'm taking my freedom, putting it on the shelf, putting it on my chain. I'm wearing around my neck. I'm taking my freedom, putting it in my car.
Let me express my thanks to you for your support across the years. We've been in this building for 47 years. Nelson Mandela spoke here, and Harold Washington spoke here. Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. and Gus Savage and Charlotte Hayes. So many people across the years. This has been a kind of refuge, a place from which we launch great ideas. Your movements for action for registration and jobs, and just another building is about to collapse under the heavy, heavy rain and winter this winter in Chicago. We need to raise $1 million for a restoration campaign. Churches, please take up a donation for us, individuals. Church made the push. People United to Serve Humanity. People United to Serve Humanity is a tax-exempt organization. This is a Rainbow Push, is a push in effect as a church. We need your support today.
Thank you for tuning in to our International Saturday morning broadcast. We need your support. Here are ways to give to Rainbow Push Coalition. Text PUSH, P-U-S-H, to pound 41444 to support the work of Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. and Rainbow Push Coalition. When you shop, Amazon gives. Visit Amazon Smile and select Push for Excellence as your charitable organization by starting your shopping at smile.amazon.com. Join us for the Rainbow Push Coalition Citizenship Education Fund Annual Convention, June 28th through July 2nd. This year's theme, 400 Years Later, Repairing the Damage Done. Register today. Go to www.rainbowpush.org.
Get involved with the movement.
Somebody. I may be poor, but I am somebody.
Join the movement.
If you're not a member, become a member.
I am somebody.
Fighting the most important battles for freedom and justice for all.
You made us change. Oh, trying to bring closer.
Join Rainbow Push.
But you're not pushing me away.
Join the movement. Join Rainbow Push.
You continually push change. And bring you closer.
Put your hands together. That makes sense to you. Very ready to Saturday morning broadcast. I want to express my thanks to Dr. Jones and to Reverend Dr. Tallier. Tallier got him a law degree. He's already got a big church involved. Now he's a big lawyer, a Baltimore lawyer. If you would give a donation to Rainbow Push, we need your support. If you're not a member of Push, then you want to join Push Stand. You want to join Push. You believe what we, as we fight for registration, we fight to stop violence, race. You want to join Rainbow Push, please stand. If you give $100 or more, please stand. You give $100 or more, please stand, whoever you are. You give $100 or more, please stand, whoever you are. Sister Jeanette, Jeanette, come stand with me, please. You give $100 or more, please stand, whoever you are.
It's a shame, it's a shame, it's a shame. Yeah. Lord, have mercy, shame. All of my love, all of my love is shame.
Thank you, Bobby. Bobby Mercer, Bobby Fiore, thank you, Dr. Sister Hansbauer. Sandra Hansbauer. Need some of that money, darling. If you've not yet, you give at least $50, please stand. You give at least $50, please stand. Convention registration is $50. If you register for the convention, if you've not registered for the convention, register today. If you've not registered for the convention, register. Repeat. If you've not registered for the convention, register today. Register today for the convention. Thank you, Bob. Mayon, hit it. Mayon, hit it higher.
It's a shame, listen. What about my love? Seems you have forgotten love. Turn me up. I do believe that something went wrong somewhere. Lord, have mercy. What about it, baby? What about the days and nights we spent together, love? What about the love we made so sweet, y'all? I wish I had some volume, y'all. That you got my love. You don't even come around. Johnny said it. Now that you got my love, I mean hanging on the line, yeah. Oh Lord, listen. He said, what about it, baby? What about the days and nights we spent together, love? What about the love we made so sweet? Are you sure you want to leave me now? Positive, baby, don't you know? I know that you might wanna change your mind. Listen, now that you got my love, you don't even come, you don't even Facebook me, don't even Twitter. Now that you got all of my love, you don't even come around now. Oh no. You wanna put me down, that you got all of my love. You got me hanging on the line. Yeah. Listen, babe, y'all can clap your hands, y'all wanna. Come on, like we here. Maybe I can change your mind.
Baby, would you change your mind?
I can't hear y'all. Maybe I can change your mind. Yeah. Ooh,
baby, I can change your mind.
I know that I messed up. I messed up sometime, but
baby, I can change your mind.
Give me one more chance. Somebody said it. Maybe I can change. Yeah.
Baby, I can change your mind.
Oh, I can change your mind, baby. If I had one more chance, these last $2,
maybe I could change
just
your mind.
Maybe I could change your mind. Yeah.
Maybe I could change your mind.
Johnny said it like this. Listen, because I need you and you need me.
Maybe I could change your mind.
I know that we'll be happy, y'all. Just you wait and see. He said, I need you and you need me.
Maybe I could change your mind.
We'll be happy. Just you wait and see. Maybe I can change your mind. Yeah.
Maybe I could change your mind.
Oh, I can change it, change it, change it, change it, change it, baby.
Maybe I could change your mind.
Take me back out here. Now that you got my love, you don't even come around. Now that you got my love, now you wanna put me down. It don't matter.
Now that you got my
love, baby.
Now that you got my
you don't even come around,
baby, would you change your mind?
Look, God. Come on, y'all, stand up.
Maybe I could change your mind.
Yeah. These last $2,
baby, I could change your mind.
I'm not gonna lose. These last $2,
baby, I could change your mind.
I declare I'm not gonna lose. Yeah. These last $2,
baby,
Let us, before he gets deep in that group, start talking about $2. Y'all ever heard Johnny sing last $2? Let's stand together. I need you by next Saturday, Bobby Rush. I want you to sell some. We must join our struggle continuously. Every day there's another battlefront. Every day another battlefront. Let's join hands. No, just stand. Don't join because I want to get the last $2 that we get. Now, across the hall is our store, T-shirts and caps and stuff. You may go there and buy some today. What time is our volunteer meeting this week, Jeanette? Tuesday night, 6 o'clock is our volunteer night. Tuesday night, 6 o'clock is our volunteer night. Come on, Mr. Mahan. Last $2.
Lady at the casino lost all her money. Said, don't feel sorry. Don't feel sorry for me, honey. If you want to do a lady a favor, yeah, here's what I want you to do, yeah. Loan me $2 for the next time I see you. But these last $2, I'm not gonna lose. Last $2, I'm not gonna lose. One going for the bus bus fare, other one for the jukebox. I got to hear me some down home blues. Said I wouldn't be over here if that man had been treating me better than this. I came on down to this.
Y'all can leave now. Y'all dismiss. Play it up, fellas. Give it to the chorus.
But these last $2, I'm not gonna lose. Last $2, open up the cymbals. One more for the bus fare, one for the jukebox.